For centuries, when we picture the biblical world, our minds default to images of pale-skinned figures dressed in flowing robes, walking through desert landscapes. This image is not just inaccurate, it is a deliberate erasure of the diverse peoples who actually lived, worked, and built these ancient civilizations. The land we call the Bible lands, stretching from Egypt through Canaan, into Mesopotamia and down into Nubia and Kush, was a crossroads of continents. It was a world where black Africans were not marginal figures, but central players in the economy, the culture, and the very fabric of daily life. To understand what jobs were like for black people 3,000 years ago, we must first strip away the Hollywood filters and look at the archaeological and textual evidence. The Bible itself, when read with honest eyes, reveals a world that was deeply connected to Africa. Egypt, Kush, modern-day Sudan, and Put, Libya or Somalia, appear repeatedly. The prophet Jeremiah asks, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin?" A rhetorical question that only makes sense if Ethiopians were a familiar, distinct presence. The Queen of Sheba, likely from the Horn of Africa, arrives in Jerusalem with a massive caravan of spices, gold, and precious stones. These were not tourists. They were traders, diplomats, and economic power players. Now, let's walk through the actual job market of the ancient Near East, circa 1000 BCE. This was the time of King David and Solomon, the rise of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and the height of Egypt's new kingdom, followed by its decline. In this world, labor was stratified by class, ethnicity, and circumstance. But black Africans were not a monolithic group. Some were slaves, yes, slavery was a brutal reality of the ancient world, and the trans-Saharan slave trade had already begun in limited forms. But many more were free artisans, soldiers, merchants, priests, and royal officials. Consider Nubia, the region south of Egypt. The Nubians were renowned as archers. For centuries, they served as mercenaries and elite soldiers in Egyptian armies. The Egyptian word for Nubia, Taseti, literally means, land of the bow. These warriors were so respected that they were often depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings, their dark skin and distinctive features clearly shown. Being a soldier was a job, a dangerous one, but one that could bring status, land, and wealth. When Egypt weakened, Nubian kings actually conquered Egypt and ruled as the 25th dynasty. These black pharaohs employed thousands of administrators, builders, and priests. The job market in Thebes and Memphis under their rule would have been vibrant with African talent. Then there were the trades. The Bible mentions Hiram, the king of Tyre, who supplied cedar and craftsmen to build Solomon's temple. But the raw materials, gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic woods, came from Africa. The ships of Tarshish, mentioned in 1 Kings, sailed the Red Sea to bring back gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Who crewed these ships? Who loaded the cargo? Who carved the ivory and worked the ebony? African artisans. The archaeological record shows that ivory carving in the Levant during this period was heavily influenced by Egyptian and Nubian styles. The craftsmen who created the intricate furniture and decorations for palaces across the region were often black. We also cannot ignore agriculture. The Nile Valley was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Black farmers worked the fertile black soil of Egypt and Nubia, growing wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus. They built irrigation canals, harvested crops, and paid taxes to the state. In the Bible, Joseph's story is set in Egypt. He becomes a high official overseeing grain storage during the famine. The people he managed were Egyptians, many of whom were black or of mixed heritage. The pyramids had already been built 1,000 years earlier, but the labor traditions continued. Farmers, herders, and fishermen along the Nile were the backbone of the economy. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the slave trade. The Hebrew Bible does record the enslavement of Israelites in Egypt, but it also records the slave trade in other directions. The prophet Amos condemns those who sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Egyptians all participated in slave markets. Black Africans were captured in wars or sold by rival tribes. However, being a slave did not mean being jobless. Slaves in the ancient world worked as domestic servants, field laborers, miners, and even skilled craftsmen. Some could earn money, by their freedom, and rise to positions of influence. The Bible itself has laws protecting slaves, such as the requirement to free a Hebrew slave after 7 years. But for foreign slaves, the rules were harsher. Yet, we must resist the temptation to reduce black people in biblical times to only slaves. That narrative serves a racist agenda, not historical truth. The evidence shows that black people were merchants, sailing the Mediterranean and Red Seas. They were priests in the temples of Ammonius and Ra. They were scribes, reading and writing in hieroglyphics and cuneiform. The famous Egyptian Tale of Weneman, from around 1075 BCE, describes a diplomat traveling to Byblos, in modern Lebanon, and encountering black sailors and traders along the way. The world was interconnected. The color of your skin did not determine your job, your birth, your skills, and your circumstances did. In summary, the first chapter of this hidden history reveals that black people in biblical times held every kind of job imaginable, from the highest royal advisor to the lowliest field hand, from the feared warrior to the peaceful farmer, from the skilled artisan to the daring merchant. The Bible's own pages, when read without prejudice, are filled with the presence of Africa. The next chapter will dive deeper into specific stories and individuals, showing how these jobs shaped the world we inherited today. But for now, remember this: the ancient world was not white. It was brown and black, and the labor of black hands built the foundations of civilization itself. Now that we've established the diversity of labor in the ancient world, let's zoom in on the specific jobs that black people held, and how these roles shaped the course of history. We often think of the Bible as a book about shepherds and fishermen, but the reality is far more complex. The ancient Near East was an industrial powerhouse, and black workers were at the heart of its most critical industries. First, consider the metalworkers. The Bible mentions Tubal-Cain as the forger of all tools of bronze and iron. But the true masters of metallurgy in the ancient world were the people of Africa. The Nubians and the people of the Kingdom of Kush were pioneering iron smelters. By 1000 BCE, the region of Meroe, in modern Sudan, had become a massive iron-producing center. The slag heaps from these ancient furnaces still exist today, some as tall as buildings. These were not primitive operations. They were sophisticated industrial sites, requiring miners, charcoal burners, furnace operators, and blacksmiths. The iron tools and weapons produced in Africa were traded across the Red Sea and into the Levant. So when King Solomon needed metal for his temple or his chariots, the raw material likely came from black hands. Then there were the shipbuilders and sailors. The Red Sea was a highway of commerce. The port of Ezion-Geber, near modern Eilat, was a hub for Solomon's fleet. But who actually built those ships? The Bible says Hiram of Tyre sent shipwrights, but the labor force was local and included many Egyptians and Nubians who had been living in the region for generations. These shipbuilders knew how to construct vessels capable of long voyages. They were the ancestors of the great maritime traditions of the Swahili coast. Once the ships were built, they needed crews. Black sailors navigated by the stars, carried cargo, and defended against pirates. They were the ones who brought back the gold of Ophir, the ivory, and the exotic animals that made Solomon's court legendary. We cannot forget the stonemasons and quarry workers. The massive stones used in the walls of Jerusalem, the temples of Egypt, and the palaces of Assyria were cut, transported, and set in place by thousands of laborers. While some were slaves, many were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. In Egypt, the quarry at Aswan was staffed by Nubian workers who extracted granite and diorite. The famous unfinished obelisk there shows the scale of their labor. These workers left inscriptions on the rocks, graffiti that records their names, their jobs, and their prayers. They were not anonymous. They were men like Penra, a chief draftsman, or hui, a sculptor. Their hands shaped the monuments that still stand today. Now, let's talk about the royal court. Black people served in high positions in foreign governments. The Bible itself gives us the story of Ebed-Melech, a Cushite official in the court of King Zedekiah of Judah. His name means, servant of the king. He was a eunuch, a common role for foreigners in royal courts. When the prophet Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern to die, it was Ebed-Melech who went to the king and pleaded for his life. He organized a rescue, using ropes and old rags to pull Jeremiah out. This man was not a slave. He was a trusted royal official, with access to the king and the authority to act. His skin color is explicitly noted in the text, yet he is treated with respect. He is a hero of the story. Then there were the musicians and entertainers. African music had a profound influence on the ancient world. The Bible mentions the harp, flute, and timbrel. But many of these instruments originated in Africa. The sistrum, a rattle used in Egyptian worship, was played by black priestesses. The lyre and the lute traveled from Nubia into Israel. David himself was a harpist, but the style of music he played was likely influenced by Egyptian and African traditions. At royal feasts, black musicians would have performed, their songs echoing through stone halls. We also have the priests and religious functionaries. In Egypt and Nubia, the priesthood was a powerful, wealthy institution. Black priests served in the temples of Karnak and Luxor. They performed rituals, maintained the sacred texts, and managed vast estates. When the Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt, they appointed their own people to the highest religious offices. The god Ammonius was especially revered in Nubia, and his oracles were consulted by kings across the region. These priests were scholars, astronomers, and healers. They understood the movements of the stars, the flooding of the Nile, and the medicinal properties of plants. Their knowledge was passed down through generations. But what about the everyday jobs? The bakers, the brewers, the weavers, the potters. In the bustling markets of Jerusalem, Gaza, and Damascus, black merchants sold spices, fabrics, and jewelry. Egyptian linen was prized throughout the ancient world, and much of it was woven by black hands. The beer that workers drank was brewed in Egypt and exported. The pots that held oil and grain were thrown on wheels by potters whose techniques came from Africa. These were the invisible workers who made civilization possible. Finally, we must acknowledge the soldiers and guards. We already mentioned Nubian archers. But there were also black mercenaries serving in the armies of Israel, Judah, and Assyria. The Bible records that the Cushites were a mighty nation. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib threatened Jerusalem, he was later assassinated by his own sons. But before that, his army included Nubian soldiers. The prophet Isaiah describes the land of Cush as tall and smooth-skinned, a people feared for their military prowess. These soldiers were professionals. They trained from youth, carried shields and spears, and were paid for their service. They were not just cannon fodder, they were elite units. So, what does all this mean? It means that the biblical world was not a white world with a few black extras. It was a world where black people were essential to every sector of the economy. They were the miners who dug the copper, the sailors who braved the sea, the officials who advised kings, the priests who spoke to gods, and the soldiers who defended borders. Their labor built the temples, the palaces, and the cities that we still study today. The next time you read a story from the Bible, remember the hidden workforce. Remember the black quarry worker sweating under the sun. Remember the Nubian archer standing guard at the city gate. Remember the Cushite official who saved a prophet's life. Their jobs were not just jobs, they were the building blocks of history. And their legacy is written in stone, in iron, and in the very pages of the book that has shaped our world.